Good morning. Good morning.
Welcome and good morning. I'm Josh Coyote, today's worship associate. Today is our October 9th, 2022 in-person and online service. Victoria McDonald, Jessica Kuipers, Elizabeth Coyote, Vic Allen, and myself bring you this service from the church's sanctuary. So welcome this morning, this day, and this opportunity to get together in community. We have a couple announcements. Downstairs after service, we will have a take-apart party, which is we take apart broken electronics.
If you're not interested, you should stay for the shared meal.
Yeah, Victoria McDonald will be announcing that later. Let's see. 2 weeks from now, on October 19th at 7 p.m., we're having a philosophy discussion on philosophy of history. Myself or Catherine Giovanna can give you the readings for that if you're interested. October 21st, we're having a family game night, so we play board games from about 5:30 till when we're done, 7-ish or 8-ish. And there's also upcoming will be some Halloween things on October 28th and a costume party on October 30th. If you're a live stream viewer, we ask you to sign in on the chat box on the screen so that we know who's joining us online. We will be having sorrows, concerns, and joys after the time for all ages. There's a basket over there if you want to put it in, or if you're online, put it in the chat and mark it as a joy, concern, or sorrow so it's easier for us to notice. And we'll be passing the basket later, or if you're online, there's also a PayPal, or you could mail in checks as well. And Victoria McDonald will now announce.
Today is our first formal shared meal downstairs, and we, in the olden days before COVID, we had a very well-oiled group. And Sadie and Bea were down there getting things ready. Then the Tanners, John and Craig, always did cleanup, and none of those people are here. So somebody else is going to have to step in to do that. So I'll have to be heating up some tortillas that I brought anyway. But we welcome men to do cleanup because the Unitarian Church is an equal opportunity organization. So, there's, men can do it, and I'll help you get set up. So I hope everybody comes. If you didn't bring food, just come down, and there's usually enough. Thanks.
We now move into the sacred time of worship. As I ring the peace bowl 3 times, take deep breaths and relax so we can move into worship. For this moment in time, let go of your anxieties, fears, and worries. Be in this moment. We will now read our church covenant. It's printed in the order of service, so if you like to, feel free to read along with us. Love is the spirit of this community, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Now we'll do our chalice lighting. Life is a gift for which we are grateful. We gather in community to celebrate the glories and the mysteries of this greatest gift.
The call to worship is something taken from a yoga book that has daily meditations, and they're all my favorites, but this one works for today. At a Native American, I can't see with these glasses, at a Native American gathering in Arizona for the 1999 summer solstice, a Hopi elder said, "There is a river flowing now, very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid. They will try to hold on to the shore. They will feel they are being torn apart and suffer greatly. Know that the river has its destination. The elders say we must push off into the middle of the river. Keep our eyes open and our heads above water. See who is in there with you and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment we do that, our spiritual growth comes to a halt. The time of the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves, banish the word struggle from your attitude and vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred way and in celebration. We are the ones we have been waiting for." And now Jessica will play hymn 175.
We celebrate the word of love, His dignity we sing, for we can see divinity in every living thing. A fragment of the perfect whole, in cactus and in quail. As much in tiny particle as in the great whole. Of ancient dreams we are the sum, our bones link stone to star, and bind our future worlds to come with worlds that were and are. Respect the water, land, and air, which give all creatures birth. Protect the lives of all that share the glory of the earth.
Tomorrow, October 10th, is Indigenous Peoples Day, a day to remember the indigenous people of this continent who were here before Europeans arrived. In honor of that day, I have found a poem. This is Our Home, But Not Just Ours, by Laura Bogle. We gather here to remember this is our home, but not just ours. This land we live on, this water we drink, this air we breathe, these old mountains that hold us steady to our ground, these forests that give us their healing green, these flowers that give us their beauty and fragrance, these fields that give us our daily bread, these stars that show us our place. The desert and the tame backyards, all of it our home. We remember the ancestors who have lived on this land and who have shaped it, the Shoshone, the Bannock, the Nez Perce, the settlers, the mountaineers, the farmers, the hunters, the immigrants, the artists, the families, the explorers, the business people, the engineers, the builders, the scientists, the teachers, the workers, the leaders. We inherit their choices. We honor the animals and creatures that have made their home in this land, the one here now and the ones that used to be here. We envision the future generations who will live on this land and let their voices fill our hearts. We gather here to remember this is our home, but not just ours. And the poem was adapted with permission of the author for this area. The end.
We will now sing the children out.
As we leave this friendly place, looking into every face, may the kindness which we learn guide our hearts till we return.
It's a special time in our congregation where each of us has an opportunity to share major events in our lives, our joys, our concerns, and our sorrows, so we can all be uplifted by our UU community. As I read the sorrows, concerns, and joys that were given to us, Victoria McDonald would light a candle. Kat has a joy. She started a new job at Bonneville School District and is loving it. Vic? We light one more candle for all the sorrows, concerns, and joys we hold in our hearts and are not ready to share at this time. Know we lift up our love for you and we are all in this together.
The reading is a poem I found. It was really fun looking for poems about salmon. And I found one written by a man named Terry Gifford celebrating the return of wild Atlantic salmon to the Connemara district in Western Ireland. And it's called A Shoaling at Toombola Bridge. They come marauding up with the tide, under the bridge between salt and fresh water, gathering themselves in the greatness of their condition, remembering this shadowed place, this taste, those far skylarks, this dark entry to the birthplace, the old underworld to be their graveled graves. Between peat banks, their decompression chamber is a river, risen by recent rains in the Big Bend Mountains, where they wimple their fins on the water's surface. In silver flashes of strength for the falls ahead, fat from the sea, beyond feeding now, feeling that thrust upstream that powered them past the nets in the neck of the bay and around foul plugs from the pipes of white shoreline houses towards the leaks and overflows of small farms they must outrun, and hopeful rods tempting with the flick of a handmade fly. Now they shoal at dusk under the fading furnace of the West. And now we'll listen to the offertory hymn, Salmon Run. Donations are gratefully received. So today I'm going to talk about the Columbia and her salmon, her dwindling salmon. And for those of you that don't know me, I lived in Alaska for 47 years, southeast Alaska, where it rains, or there's enough precipitation for about 13, 14 feet a year. So we had plenty of water. And that, of course, helps the fish and the trees. It's very lush. But I was always concerned about the Columbia because we heard that the biggest kings that ever survived were in the Columbia River. And I hope that can continue. Survival of wild Pacific salmon is very important to many, including me, in the Pacific Northwest. As a young woman growing up in Idaho, I'd been sport fishing for silvers off the Oregon coast with my father, and it seemed as if the fish were endless. But the days of massive salmon runs off the West Coast have come to an end. In 1974, I left a teaching contract in Salmon, Idaho, sort of heading this way, and headed to Southeast Alaska with no idea what I had signed up for. I traveled with two men, one of whom I eventually married, a courageous long-haired dog, a 3-hole covered canoe for transportation because there aren't very many roads, and very little money. Leaving the Alaska Marine Ferry in Wrangell on Halloween night, we embarked on an amazing adventure that only a fool would attempt. The salmon season had ended, and since we barely had enough money for food, we lived in a variety of ramshackle, rent-free cabins, and I do mean ramshackle, like leaking, 30 miles from Wrangell. We survived that winter, which was mild and wet, and we did not drown as we paddled to Wrangell for groceries. And the next summer, we met commercial salmon fishermen who advised us we could support ourselves commercial fishing. My future husband crewed on a trawler that summer while I worked in the salmon cannery, and we soon realized it's far more exciting to deal with live fish rather than dead. The following spring, my parents co-signed a loan for a small hand trawler, and that summer we fished in Chatham Strait for king salmon, cohos, we call them silvers, and pinks or humpies. There's 2 others, but they eat plankton, sockeye, and chum salmon, so we didn't catch those. Salmon are a vital food species for Alaska natives and numerous tribes in the lower 48 who depend on those fish for their way of life. Their rituals depend on the return of salmon. Throughout the spring, summer, and fall, little pulses come through. We learned about the salmon life cycle, one of the miracles of life. Adults return to their natal streams after a 2-year absence for pinks, 4 years for cohos, 5 for sockeye, and 3, 4, 5 years for kings. Eggs are deposited in the fresh water during the summer, where they overwinter, and in spring the young smolts make a dash for the sea. All salmon, little tiny smolts, make the transition from fresh to saltwater, which is very demanding for their kidneys. After their allotted time in the Pacific, adult fish return, where they now reverse the process and become accustomed to fresh water. It takes them about a week to go back and forth. After our successful summer season, we settled in Kake, spelled K-A-K-E, a native village of maybe 500. We never had any census, so we didn't know. And I was hired to teach first grade. I'd teach for 9 months, and on the last day of school, leave for the fishing grounds, returning in late August for another year of school. Over the years, we continued to listen and learn from Native and Caucasian fishermen, eventually buying a bigger boat, a $25,000 power patrol permit, and finally, about 10 years later, a gill netter that needed a $45,000 gill net permit that I fished. And there's a lot of negative information about high seas gill netting that you've probably all heard about, but American fishermen cannot use that single strand transparent gill net set by the foreign boats. we have to use a 25 very narrow strand nylon net. And that's how we caught sockeye, pinks, chum, sometimes a king, sometimes humpies, but they also gum up with plankton, jellyfish that spatters all over in your face, and ocean debris that floats through. We lived in Cake for 10 years. I had 2 children, and we learned about the politics surrounding fish. We arrived in the same year that a federal judge set Washington State's fisheries into turmoil. Fishermen were furious after Judge Bolt recognized the treaty rights of the 1850s. Treaties that gave tribes the right to fish in their customary areas and catch a fairly large allotment of fish because of their dependence. Originally, the tribes had given up huge tracts of land, and when the state curtailed their allotment, they resorted to the courts in the 1940s and 50s. Lawsuits dragged on for years as natives were jailed, one of them 19 times in jail, for fishing in an area granted to the tribe by treaty. After years of legal wrangling and moving through the U.S. District Court for Western Washington, the case landed on the desk of Judge Bolt, who was a hard worker. He held court 6 days a week, including Labor Day. Judge Bolt created a firestorm when he held the government's promise to secure the fisheries for the tribes that were central to the treaty-making process, and that 100-plus-year-old treaties gave tribes their original fishing rights. He then ordered the state of Washington to limit fishing for non-Indians, who of course now outnumbered the natives. Violent clashes ensued, but in 1975, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit upheld Judge Bolt's decision. Fish numbers had been decreasing for decades, but there was always something or someone to blame. But now many fishermen were looking at a very bleak season as their numbers were so curtailed. Many of them headed to Alaska, which I also did, which then created the Limited Entry Commission, which again curtailed the number of fishermen. You had to have that expensive permit. It was apparent by then that salmon runs could be decimated by overfishing. But one magnificent river to the south, the Columbia, that once nurtured the biggest kings and untold numbers of the other 4 salmon species, had been transformed since the 1850s. Industrialists viewed the Columbia as a means of wealth as subsidized dams that created cheap electricity, wealth selling water for irrigation, and a cheap means of transport for agricultural products and goods from the western states. I listened to stories about the vanishing salmon runs on the Columbia, but did not understand the full story until I read A River Lost: The Life and Death of the Columbia by Blaine Harden, an award-winning journalist, published in 2012. Mr. Harden is a far more talented writer than I. And I'm going to read what he said. I can't tell you the whole book. The first time I read it, my heart broke, and I sometimes couldn't read very far, but now I'm tougher and I can handle it. This book is about the destruction of the Columbia by well-intentioned Americans whose lives embodied a pernicious contradiction. They prided themselves on self-reliance, yet depended on subsidies. They distrusted the federal government, yet allowed it to do as it pleased with the river and the land through which it flowed. As long as there was federal money, they did not mind that farmers wasted water, that dams pushed salmon to extinction, or that plutonium workers recklessly spilled radioactive gunk at Hanford next to the river. Users of the Columbia, the generous and God-fearing Westerners among whom I grew up, remained locked in old habits of pride, denial, independence. My story of the river is a memoir, a history, and a lament for a splendid corner of the American West that maimed itself for the sake of subsidized prosperity and that continues not to understand why. I won't read you anymore, but it's all good. Mr. Hardin describes the river as he climbs aboard the Outlaw, a tugboat that pushed 6 barges longer than 2 football fields and held 12,000 tons of peas, lentils, wheat, computer games, wood chips, and polyurethane-coated milk cartons, headed to the consumers of the Pacific Rim. 2 men ran that massive barge, an overweight skipper and a muscular deckhand. Owing their livelihood to a tightly engineered river, they were suspicious of those who promoted free-flowing rivers. Their enemies were windsurfers, Indians, fish biologists, environmentalists, federal judges and bureaucrats. Just a minute. Salmon fishermen and the residents of Seattle and Portland. Blaine assured the men on the tug that he understood them and was a beneficiary of the dammed rivers, although he did expose the hypocrisy. Using this subterfuge, he was able to record their stories and produce this book. The lower Snake and mid-Columbia now move at 1 mile per hour, thanks to the 24 federal dams. More than 100 whitewater rapids, such as Celilo Rapids, where natives once speared fish, are drowned. Dredges have scooped out channels in both the Snake and the Columbia to 14 feet, 5 feet deeper than the Mississippi. Almost 40% of our wheat travels on this river highway, which has been greatly modified. The river offers the cheapest form of transport, but that means death to salmon. In high water years, about 60% of juvenile salmon don't make it to the Pacific. In low water years, 90% of the young salmon perish. Barely 2% survive to spawn, just enough to maintain survival. In 1992, 18 years after the Bolt decision, 1 adult sockeye salmon returned to Redfish Lake in Idaho, named for the reddish color of the spawning salmon that once had filled the lake. The fish was named Lonesome Larry. I remember hearing about him on the radio while I was in Alaska. And Idaho's then governor, Cecil Andrus, had him stuffed, mounted, and displayed for visitors as a reminder of how dams had ruined Idaho's heritage. Larry's frozen sperm, along with the fresh sperm of other adult sockeye males who made it back to in the following years, fertilized the eggs of female salmon who returned to Redfish Lake in the 90s. Now, humans are reluctant to admit that their efforts to subdue the earth are less than miraculous. The hydropower industry suggested building hatcheries to replace wild salmon. So hatcheries were built at the mouths of creeks, but biologists soon realized that raising salmon is not easy. If too many salmon are crowded into their net pens, diseases can spread in a day and kill every fish. At first, only the females were given tender care, as the males were carelessly stripped of their milt. But then fish biologists realized that males were as delicate as the females, so greater care was taken with them. Another crucial realization was that genetic diversity of wild salmon is essential for the species' survival. Some creeks in Alaska have a high content of arsenic that will kill a hatchery fish. Mining waste leaches copper into the water, and copper in incrementally small amounts dulls the scent that salmon need to find their creek. Also, when hatchery fish are released in the spring, they depend on the food that the wild salmon require, and scientists still do not know how much this affects the numbers of wild fish. And hatcheries are expensive. Money spent on Washington state hatcheries in 2011 was 130 to 140 million. For the adult fish that returned, that each one cost 250 and up to 600 apiece when the runs are below average. Billions have been spent on hatcheries as salmon numbers decline. Smolts are now being sucked into huge tankers and hauled downstream to get past the dams, but it's great expense and high mortality for young fish. No matter how much money has been thrown at salmon, their numbers decline. One breeding project utilized hatcheries in Idaho's Redfish Lake and was part of a final effort to save Idaho's wild salmon. The project came to fruition in 2011 when several hundred sockeye returned to Redfish Lake. But I doubt that many of us humans appreciate the heroic salmon who swim back to Idaho. Leaving the Pacific Ocean, negotiating the Columbia and Snake River dams and the river itself, fish travel about 1,800 miles following the convoluted, treacherous path of the rivers. The elevation of Redfish Lake is 6,547 feet, an amazing climb from sea level, done without pausing for even a snack. A few days ago, I listened to a blurb about returning sockeye to Redfish Lake. 736 sockeye returned this year, but only 40 of those were wild. Hearing joyful news about returning fish terrifies those employed to run the barges. They realize salmon protection requires massive modification or dam removal. But one suggestion for saving salmon a few decades ago was to draw down the Snake, unplugging reservoirs during summer months and allowing the Columbia to flow more like a river, and whisking young salmon out to sea while protecting them from turbines, predator fish, and warm water that kills all salmon. But that idea means less water for irrigation, and barges would not be able to run during the summer. Now, 10 years after the book was published, our current long-lasting drought will not allow reservoirs to flow freely. But a more radical solution, not radical in my opinion, being discussed is to remove the 4 federal dams on the lower Snake that were constructed in the 1960s and 70s. Lower Granite, 40 miles downstream from Lewis, Little Goose, Lower Monumental, and Ice Harbor. The Snake River Area Office in Boise manages 27 dams and reservoirs and has faced never-ending criticism from the decimated and steelhead fishermen. And consideration of dam removal is facing an outcry from those on the other side who are accustomed to cheap rates for shipping, plentiful water, although a rail line does run along the river, but it costs more. One more significant danger awaits adult salmon as they prepare to enter the Columbia on their journey home. The Marine Mammal Protection Act does not allow the killing of any marine mammal, and massive sea lions and those cute harbor seals wait for the salmon at the mouth of the Columbia, gobbling returning adults. All sorts of devices have been utilized. Underwater M80s, a dangerous and illegal firecracker that frightens marine mammals but affects salmon. In certain areas where we fished in Southeast Alaska, sea lions raided our nets. They cruise along the cork line and they grab only the sockeye, the most expensive and delicious, and what we needed. We called sockeye money fish. Sea lions are smart and powerful, and they're unafraid of being shot because they realize we're all out there together, and if you shoot, you might hit a boat. But not all is beyond hope. One positive event for Pacific salmon is the Elwha Dam on the Olympic Peninsula that was blasted apart in 2011. All 5 species of salmon once spawned in the 45-mile-long river until a dam was built in the early 1900s, and of course, no fish passage. Salmon were restricted then to 5 miles of spawning habit. Prior to the dam, 400,000 salmon returned annually to the Elwha, but after the dam, their numbers quickly declined, and they were, by the time 2011 rolled around, there were about 4,000 returnees. The dams also blocked sediment so that riverbanks eroded as the water was blocked from flowing downstream, often leaving native ancestral homelands and religious sites flooded. After years of tribal protests and community organizing in 1992, Congress passed the Elwha Restoration Act, purchasing the dam for $29.5 million. Finally, in 2011, 19 years after the act was passed, the dam was torn down. I wonder why it took so long, but I imagine there was ferocious arguing as humans had to accept that progress was saving fish, not the production of cheap electricity. In the first year after the dam removal, 4,000 returning Chinook salmon were welcomed. In 2014, approximately 32,000 coho swam to the middle reach of the Elwha, an area that had not seen coho in more than a century. As the fish return, the bears, cougar, mink, bald eagles, and otter appear along with the American dipper, our single aquatic songbird. Predictions are that in 20 or 30 years, original numbers could return. But as the vast Pacific Ocean warms, all marine life is threatened. Another river being undammed is the Klamath in southern Oregon and northern California. In August 26, 2022, federal regulators issued a final environmental impact statement that supports removing the massive dams on the Klamath to save imperiled salmon. This $500 million project agrees with the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's vote, and will be the largest dam demolition project in the United States. The 4 dams cut the 253-mile-long river in half for migrating salmon and disastrously cut their fish runs. King salmon runs are down 98%. So the Yurok tribe, which traditionally depended on those fish, instead now buys fish in a grocery store for their annual salmon fish festival. Tribes are reasserting their treaty rights as they recognize the power of being a sovereign nation. For instance, the Upper Columbia United Tribes, consisting of the Coeur d'Alene, the Colville, Kalispel, Kootenai, I can't remember how to pronounce it, and the Spokane tribes are advocating for stronger runs on the Upper Columbia. And Riverkeeper, a group that hopes to prevent dredging and further industrialization on the Columbia, also advocates, I'm going to have to get a drink here. Riverkeeper, excuse me, advocates cleaning up the contamination left by the Hanford nuclear site. And years ago, I read that the ocean absorbs vast amounts of carbon dioxide, and I thought, great, global warming will be slowed. But no, carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater and forms carbonic acid, which decreases the available salmon in the ocean water. Increased acidity means crab, clams, shrimp, lobster, oysters, scallops, and any creature with a shell is more vulnerable as it takes longer to develop their protective exoskeleton. And plankton, that little infinitesimal thing that sockeye and chum rely on, is the basic food source for all marine life, and they also need calcium to form their little tiny shells. My final tribute to the persistence of Pacific salmon is personal. I have a lot of these stories, but this one works. In 1996, 3 Alaska friends asked if I wanted to canoe on the Little Salmon, a tributary of the mighty Yukon River that flows from far western Alaska into northern British Columbia. They had 2 Old Town canoes and needed a 4th paddler. It took a few minutes for me to say yes. My son stayed with a family friend, and a week later, we rode the ferry north to Skagway and drove to Whitehorse, BC. We began paddling downstream and made 100 miles in 10 days, mostly oxbows, so we didn't travel very far on a map. And we saw very few other canoers. One afternoon, we drifted over a very shallow stretch of water, and we could see through the clear water massive reddish fish, calmly swimming upstream, searching for a suitable area to spawn. Of course, we knew not to bother them. They had swum at least 1,500 miles, living on their body fat. Genetic diversity enabled them to develop powerful bodies and be able to store that incredible amount of fat for survival. If those fish disappear, there are no fish on Earth able to replace them. In closing, the future of salmon on the Columbia River is uncertain, but I am optimistic that other federal judges will support the tribes as sovereign nations, alongside dedicated environmentalists, to demand that Native treaty rights be reinstated and that salmon are a keystone species. The fact that any salmon survived to swim into Idaho tells me how determined those fish are. And now, our closing hymn, 100, I've got peace like a river. Closing words are by Liesl Mueller. Hope. It hovers in dark corners before the lights are turned on. It shakes sleep from its eyes and drops from mushroom gills. It explodes in the starry heads of dandelions turned sages. It sticks to the wings of green angels that sail from the tops of maples. It sprouts in each occluded eye of the many-eyed potato. It lives in each earthworm segment, surviving cruelty. It is the motion that runs from the eyes to the tail of a dog. It is the mouth that inflates the lungs of the child that has just been born. It is the singular gift we cannot destroy in ourselves, the argument that refutes death, the genius that invents the future, all we know of God. It is the sermon that makes us swear not to betray one another. It is this poem trying to speak.
We will now extinguish the chalice with the following words. They're in your order of service if you wish to join us. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.